only evaluate hand paper-making artisanship, such as paper-making itself, that industry, printmaking industries, and many other arts with the politics of skill. With the use of the internet, the 24/7 global news cycle, and other rapid technological advancements, we've seen a velocity of change in the structure of contemporary culture unlike any other. I'm interested that in our times we're progressively losing our ability to remember. That's because electronic media devices take over the function, the instant recall of cases from the past by our ubiquitous digital machines. Neuroscientists say that a goldfish has the attention span of 8 seconds, and we as humans have the attention span of 9 seconds. So we surely live in the FOMO age, the fear of missing out age. There we go. Let's start with the premise of social theorist Hannah Arendt, who wrote a wonderful book, The Human Condition. Arendt designates 3 fundamental human activities: labor, work, and action. About labor, she states that it is the activity that corresponds to the biological process of the human body, whose spontaneous growth, metabolism, and eventual decay are bound to the vital necessities produced and fed into the life process by labor. The human condition of labor is life itself. For example, the labor we experience as artists, and in particular in the area that I will discuss, paper artists, printmakers, book artists, is truly related to our touch, seeing, and feeling. All 3 of these human activities require sustainable development, and I will explore some of those ideas. At the same time, though, our global aesthetics are mostly driven by the creation of moving images. I myself have made a print. This is one of my fondest prints I've ever made, that explores the hand and what it has to do to create a mezzotint. A mezzotint means that you make a whole copper plate black, and it takes hours and hours of pressing this tool in your hand until it becomes sore, and sometimes it gets black from the ink that's on the handle. And so in this image you see the mezzotint rocker at the top and my hand at the bottom, and it's called the ground by apparatus. To me, this is a really complete description of the process that has been embedded in me for a very long time. So the other 2 things I'll talk about are embodiment of material and process, and how it's embedded in the community. So the visual aesthetics, the global aesthetics that are very interesting now, and as I mentioned, mostly through video, Instagram, many creative technological ways, are territory, identity, borders, intersections, the body, creation, and power. The waning of time ceases to exist in video, and Instagram that provide instant information. And Nam June Paik, visionary video artist, said, "The culture that is going to survive in the future is the one that you carry around in your head and affects your nervous system." I surely feel that's true when I'm working in the paper mill, because there's always something going on in the nervous system as well as the labor. I could not agree more with that, and in contrast, though, in this concept, I'm going to describe occasions where time is a pure contributor to end fulfillment. So we might begin by saying certain patterns have changed the art world psychology as we know it. Paper has already changed civilization, and so have books. Paper is a platform for social relations and placemaking. Letterpress handwork setting by type is an engagement that demands time as an artistic practice, so that it is so rewarding. It differs from computational language that collapses and expands language at the same time. Every book is a heterotopia, providing spaces of otherness And you should look up his work, those of you that are working in video or any of the other moving images. He's quite an extraordinary artist. Now, in relation to that, though, on the other hand, I'll keep doing these other hands. Oxford scholar Peter Frankopan has given us some very interesting facts in his essay. The Silk Road from the Eastern Mediterranean to China's Pacific shore is once again the center of the world. Frankopan states, the instant communications made possible by recent technological changes do not make us susceptible to the breathless commentary about globalization as something new. For more than 2 millennia, news and information, goods and products, ideas and belief have flowed through the networks linking the Pacific coast of China with the Atlantic coast of North Africa and Europe, the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, with the Mediterranean and Scandinavia. Since the late 19th century, these networks have been known as the Silk Roads. He goes on. In fact, to understand the world, the best place to look is not the center of the West, nor the heart of the East, but on the old Silk Road where the two come together. The nations of the Silk Roads are sometimes called developing countries, but they are actually some of the world's most highly developed countries, where the world's greatest religions burst into life: Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, as well as Iran, Iraq, and Russia, particularly southern Russia. These are the very crossroads of civilization, fanning out in every direction, routes along which pilgrims and warriors, nomads and merchants have traveled, goods and produce have been bought and sold, and ideas have been exchanged, adapted, and refined. The Silk Roads are the world's central nervous system, connecting far-flung people and places and allowing us to see patterns and links, causes and effects that remain invisible if one only looks at Europe or North America. So then, focusing on what are some of the industries that continue. You saw right here before an age-old printing press from the Netherlands that is printing fabric for Africa. And this again I saw in the Philadelphia Museum across from Calais' work. And I was fascinated by the quality of the printing on fabric and how it was utilized for fashion. And this has been going on for hundreds of years. And the bolts of fabric that are sold in South Africa, the imagery of putting it into a colonial outfit and on the cover of Vogue magazine. The focusing on the physical location and historical legacy in such countries as Africa and China, by doing that we can see its resources create the reason for plant materials to be transformed into sheets of paper, where I will show you in Jiaxing and Anhui Prefecture, which I visited. However, the compelling paradoxes and mystery still reside. Why are these arts so significant in a global world of electronic spectacle? Understanding the embodiment of the natural material and its prowess to be made into another transformed natural material by hand is a lesson in daily life, industry, art, and science. An age-old tradition, the endurance of hand paper making, is also a hybrid of so many complex parts that only very dedicated communities can sustain its legacy and effectiveness into usefulness in other parts of China and the world. So you may ask, why am I interested in this? Why does this play into my personal interests? I've always been interested in exploring life and ingenuity of indigenous populations in regards to hand industries and the ecologies that sustain them. I grew up in a small town, going very near to my grandfather's farmland, and I was exposed from childhood to the cycles of growing and harvesting. Lately, this has caused me to ponder what is an indigenous vocabulary grown from cultural experience in which living organisms play a part. So we're going to look at these two places in China, and I'm indebted to Jakob Eifert, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, because he wrote this great book, Eating Rice from Bamboo Shoots, which is to say, instead of being able to make a living and sustain agriculture and have food on the table, we're using the bamboo shoots for paper, and that will make a living. It's a very, very great title. And this, he visited China in 1995, and he's the one I'm also concerned with investigating the potentials of collective memory at the site of these hand-driven productions and seeing how they make cultural bridging for Indigenous people. So we will also later on look at the Working Man Collective and the role of Peter Wyman, the Floating Lab Collective, and recent projects by Selim Bashi from Turkey and Elsa B. Dixon, the native of South Africa. These are some of your colleagues and faculty here. To end this introduction, may I say, the mid-20th century has seen the beginning of a new epoch on Earth, the Anthropocene. It's characterized by geographical and environmental changes made by humans. These artists as activists speak as true protagonists in the drama of both human rights and the survival of planet Earth. Now I'm going to take you to some images that are web images, just to show you when you extract information from the web. It's not always so easy to read. But I was very interested in how an artist would take what's around him and his environment and create works of art. So this is Bedouin artist Aid Hadalin. And what he is doing is making bulldozers, helicopters, diggers, tractor trucks, all from things that are around him in plastic and glass and furniture and so forth, breaking it down and making this miniature imitation that suggests mockery, hand mockery on one hand, and on the other, the power of creative responses to the occupation. So he lives in a tent and he's doing this work as an artist. Another thing that fascinated me, and I do apologize for the quality of this, but again, I took it off the internet just to show you some difference. So there was a photographer that was asked to photograph nomads and what they had in their contents of their tent. And what's so interesting here is that this couple has grown out a TV, and the symbolism of that stands out to me as it suggests unification of thought. But much of China has control of its media, so it's also the drama of human rights and needs. And I also just love the way they lined everything up with the sewing machine and the oven and everything else there that they need to survive in the environment. So those nomads then will take us to a more sophisticated environment. When I went to China, I looked up Lin Tianmao, an artist who does beautiful handwork and also does video art with her husband. It so happened she was installing a show at the Beijing Contemporary Art Center when Shanshan and I arrived. And we were very pleased that she gave us her time during the installation, which actually might have been more exciting than just going abstractly to the exhibit itself. The title of her show was Always the Same. So we came in and there were these 30-foot panels that had been constructed with her helpers, and they were beautifully made out of woven damask cloth, and each sculptural object on the cloth was wrapped in silk. But the subjects themselves, always the same, were very much about destruction and degeneration. So out of the beauty came her statements. We were fortunate to see how they got these up on the wall, because several of them were just coming out of a bubble wrap, and to carry these around is pretty extraordinary as meaningful work. She had all three stages of the building for her show. It was a huge show. Now what's interesting also is that I'm convinced she does look back to other antecedents, and that's why the title is so meaningful, always the same, because this red piece is really a random jumble of threads, and in the center you'll see again, which she uses often, the little gold skulls. And Chansha and I visited a government museum, which was in homage to a period in China where women bound their feet. And if you look, there's a confluence there between these caged installations to show the work. And I think also the color red is very significant to Lin Tianmao. That was an extraordinary museum because you walked in and the floor was uneven, so you felt like your feet were bound. The other process that I find amazing with Lin Tianmao is how she inventories the each one has a number, and they're wrapped in the silk, and then we know where to place them. Very extraordinary artist. We were staying nearby in a hotel that was near a museum for the Tibetan population that is quite large in Chengdu in Sichuan Prefecture. And I was very taken by just the natural installation of revering the stones. The stones are marked with messages about that population losing a lot of their loved ones through earthquakes. And so there was a stone epitaph there, how many earthquakes there have been, and in that prefecture, Abe prefecture, how many were lost. But the museum was of such high quality, and we learned a lot there. And from there, we went to the normal university, and we had a visiting artist program where we sent our prints of faculty and students to Sichuan Normal University, and their students sent their prints by students and faculty here, so we now have their collections. And we also exchanged visiting faculty. So on the second floor, this young woman was making the most beautiful abstract landscape image. And I looked at the paper and it was so thin and so fragile. I said, how could you possibly print a woodcut on this paper? And she said, would you like to have the print? I'd like to give it to you. So she signed it, and it's now in the print studio. You can go and see. So what they do with this paper, this is specifically to this area. Most everyone uses this one paper for woodcut. And before printing, they rub the back of the paper with a wax candle to strengthen it before they hand print it with the barren. And it's a very arduous process, and this paper stands up to it. So I was really fascinated by that. So one of Shanshan's friends came to us and said, would you like to see the paper mill? It's about 3 hours from here. We were supposed to go to Haifa, an Anhui prefecture, which is known for their quality papers. Of course, we said yes. And we got in a bus with students and faculty and drove up to Zhejiang. This county in Sichuan province has a family named Yang, and there are 5 people in this mill doing the industry. It's red soil where little agriculture will grow, so it's been noted since 1650 as a site for the earliest paper making in the area. 1930s and 40s, paper making reached a peak, and there were 60,000 paper makers in the area. In 1949, the socialist revolution came and the industry contracted. In 1959 and 61, the famine killed 25 million people in the countryside. In 1980, there was a recovery of the paper mills, and this paper is now produced for calligraphy and woodcut. So when we entered this paper mill, we realized we were in place of 13 centuries of paper making. These 2 men with cigarettes hanging out of their mouths were completely nonplussed in there. Their goal was to make about 500 sheets of paper a day, in a 10-hour day. So they're making about a sheet a minute, and they're long. And they're dipping it over a mold in great rhythm, sliding off the water. There's no decal as we know it in Western paper making. It's all the hand being able to control. And then transferring it to a pile of paper. So that's 2 out of the 5. Then it's pressed and it goes to this young woman who's parting the paper by hand with a tweezer in piles of 10. So it's been made very carefully, and then she just very irreverently rolls it up. Then it goes in piles of 10 upstairs to a limestone wall where it dries. And after it's dried, the 10 sheets can be separated. Here is the young woman who told us about the paper mill, and to her right is the manager of the paper mill. She's a very young mother who goes off on her scooter, picks up her kids from school, and comes back to control the industry. And she has a helper who separates the paper when they dry, and he didn't have the use of one arm. this man had a much thicker thigh on his left leg than his right leg because they were pounded away. If you look back to their mill and their house, it's a very successful complex. They're doing extremely well. So I asked Shan and the others, could we, on the way back, talk to the women who were separating these plant fibers, and I was so moved by this work because it's very hazardous. They're wearing masks, and they sit all day long swinging and cleaning this fiber to add it to the bamboo. And what touched me a lot was there was one man, there was 4 women and 1 man. Shan has heard me tell this story because I love it so much. So it says, Shan, go on over and see why he's not with the women. Being a feminist, I have to know. And he said, I have nothing to say. So they all worked all day long barefoot. This is the labor of art. And paper in Asia is thought of as the true art form, even without a language on it. Then the irony is I came back to Sichuan and we were walking to the museum and I saw this cafe that had all these post-it notes. And I thought, what a great installation. What a neat idea. And again, I couldn't read them because they were in Chinese. I don't think you were with me at that point. Were you, Shan? I was with the teacher. Anyway, you didn't know all what they were saying either. But we figured it might be secretive or epithet or lovely to them. It was just wonderful. They were piled on top of one another. The cafe was completely warm. I then had the opportunity to go into the museum and see very beautiful papers and brush paintings from ancient times. This is, as you can see, they had a table for counting and other things. From there, we visited Anhui Prefecture. Completely different situation for paper making. And here, the government supports this mill. The fibers are dried out in the sun. The belief is that it's yin yang, that the harvesting in May and June and that sort of operation, the dew will buffer the paper and make it a brighter white. And so what we began to learn between the visitation of the 2 mills is a couple of important things. The fibers are different, the process is similar. Inside, this was a museum, not a working paper mill. It had higher-end equipment, was visited probably by more people. The vats are more beautiful stone. But everything else was the same. Now, they did steam dry the papers there so it had a harder surface. They also made beautiful watermarks. So they leave the suit, what's called the suit, the top of the mold, and then wire is woven in between, and that mark is in the paper, is the manufacturer's image. This woman was doing that. And this young man was an Olympic star, but he also worked in the paper mill. And papers being curated. And then there were all these beautiful value-added products. So it's a much more sophisticated end product. Let's just go through the things now that I want you to know about this. So the embodied skills that are sensory are the smell and the taste of the pulp, the sound of pressing to know what's right, experience to know recipes that can't be repeated, no scales, no exact amounts of the fiber. Everything is experiential. The harvesting of the biological process and fermentation for the bamboo. And now I wanted to make this an industry. As soon as they started to write everything down, it didn't work because it wasn't embodied, it wasn't sensory. It's embedded in the community because a lot of these workshops, the makers themselves, their family name means paper maker. And even though paper makers died out, that tradition was kept and there was reciprocity. There's no secretness about sharing the information. And so it was passed down as a 17th century legacy. And there's an obligation felt to share the skill. Many of the paper makers are born or married into the work. The skill is judged by membership. It's an entitlement. It's a citizenship of skill. So then we went to the University of Haifa, and we were lucky really something because the brush on this would never work on the paper judging. It would have been too coarse and all would have bled. On this paper, it's magnificent. And so we wanted to see what happens in the classroom. And we visited through the courtesy of a professor to see that first the students learned by looking at masterworks and using the brush. And I love that the cell phone is ever present. So that's the experience of paper in China. All art was a one-time contemporary. So even though we're looking at these age-old traditions, we have to think about the use of the paper. And Tim Barrett, who went on a Fulbright to Japan and received a MacArthur Genius Award for his knowledge of the history of paper making, when he first went to Japan, he always asked his master paper maker, well, can we use pineapple? Can we use it? And he kept saying, what kind of paper do you want and what do you use it for? And Tim would keep asking, well, I see this, can we use that? And finally he got to the point that unless you know what you're working with as an artisan or an artist, there's no reason to try things out. So to do your research has to be embodied into the why you're using the paper. In San Juanito, in Mexico, there are the Otomi Indians that have been pounding the fig bark for ever so long. And I wanted to go visit there for almost 25 years, so finally, 2 summers ago, I got to do that. Very few people know about this village. When we asked the tourist agency, we asked our Airbnb, and we asked anyone we could think of in Mexico, would they take us there and how we get there? They said it doesn't exist. So that's how hidden the treasure of this village is. But once we found out where it was, the manager of the hotel and our driver couldn't wait to go and see this. So we all got in the van and went up to San Juanito, which is an artisan community, where they take the inner bark. When you come into the village, you hear everyone pounding, you hear the beating of the spider. And today, Rick Black, are you still here? Showed us a beautiful book, thank you, that he's been working on for 10 years. And he has some of this on the plan. I said I would be sure to point it out to you this in his book. That's printed. It's a strong surface. So when we first got there, we saw all these fibers out drying. Not dissimilar to China or Japan, but much coarser and much wider. So the quantity of the material is all very important in making paper. And we went down in this little lean-to, and there were mothers, and they do the most production in the village, and they court you first to see what they're doing. So the fig is cooked, and then the boards that are scored off are the exact size of the paper. The paper is light and dark naturally from the plant. They beat it with a volcanic stone so it won't stick, which is around the area. And then this is a great surprise. They had an old soccer ball, so they cut it up and it's smooth, and that's what they burnish the surface of the paper with, is a soccer ball. These are the trees, the fig trees. Now, usually I had always thought that it would be a small plant like you would see in China or Japan. They use these very mature trees for the process. And one of the mothers showed us how they cut out the inner bark by taking off the outer bark. And then they cook that, and that's what she used. She was just wonderful. You can see the scale difference there. And as you go up the street, it gets a little bit more sophisticated in terms of artisanship. So the next maker was doing this rather minimalist, beautiful border of brown, and the interior was white. And mostly these papers are sent to Guerra, where they do very colorful painting. That's what sells in the marketplaces all over Mexico. But they really treasure when you come to the village and you can see the more pure element. One of these was 5 by 5 feet, all hand cut, dark on white, and it was duplicating the Aztec calendar that we saw in Puebla in book. Magnificent interpretation. So one of the kids on the street said, don't you want to see my uncle? He does the spirit papers. We said, sure. So we went up, and I was tempted to buy this big roll of paper here. And now you'll see in my work that I'm doing all this by hand, and I said, you might buy that paper. He's cutting these figures, and they are coffee or cocoa. If they have boots on, don't get it because they're made for tourists. And if you notice that, don't buy them. So they're very beautifully formed. They're doing a lot of innovative kind of texture now in the work. We went back to Mexico City to see the Diego Rivera murals in the municipal center, and to our great delight, he had done a mural of the Amate paper makers from San Pablito. So this is a very, very old fresco that Diego Rivera did. You see them pounding the bark and forming the shapes and everything I've just shown. And that's the next Amate paper for sure. So changing now, I want to say, how does this all relate to contemporary relational aesthetics? At George Mason, I was very honored to work with Paul So from the Krasnow Institute of Physicists, and we created something called the SOFA Lab, the Science of Art Laboratory, where we put scientists and artists together to explore what are the common themes, what are the things that are different, what are the hypotheses that a scientist does, what is the experimentation that an artist does, and how can we engage those two processes together. So one of the artists we brought in was Celine Bacci. She and her husband from Hungary, she's from Turkey, he's from Hungary, are really involved in forestry and understanding plant material from looking at the earth and under microscopes. And so Celine does use fungus and microbial growth in her work. And this was part of her thesis show at the University of Maryland. It's called Contamination. To the naked eye, you can't originally see any change of color, but as they grow, you make these great abstractions. And she had numbers of panels at her thesis show to correlate what the fungus could do. She also, and I can't animate this, she did a world map of all the different growths of fungus, and you could see how they were changing throughout the world. No, this is Peter Moynihan. He didn't know I was going to talk about him, I'm glad you see it. If I make any mistakes, you'll tell me. I love this work because it's taking the work out into the community, where we're no longer thinking of the white box. We're thinking of social sculpture, street art, graffiti art, mural art, public art, community art, as part of the concern of relational aesthetics, which you all know about, I'm sure you're studying it. So what are the means that we can take it into the community? And Peter did a piece that I was lucky to see early on in the show at Montgomery College, and it was called Sickness Done in 2009. And he had created tables, not exactly this piece, but he created tables where he could sit at one side and someone who had an illness would sit at the other side. And while they were talking, he asked them to draw without thinking about drawing. And that random mark making came emotionally from the artist. And then afterwards, they erased the table, and the sickness of the drawing was documented, and then it began again for a new person. The photographs themselves were very, very touching to see the drawings, and then to understand why Peter had done this as a meaning of contact with the other in a community that we didn't know, and to bring them into this engagement. The other piece that I really love is called Prospect, a Moving Conversation, where in New York, he asked people, instead of shaking hands, the value of an agreement. And so he had them carry these tables, a kind of absurd act, into the park, and then they were asked to feel how it felt to carry the burden. And I don't know what other conversations went on. I'm sure very likely. And I thought that was another extraordinarily interesting project to carry the art into a public space and engage in conversation and have the participant carry the burden as well as the artist. One other project I really love is something that Edgar Andrés did with Provisions Library with the artisans in Medellin, Colombia. And this is also part of the Working Man Collective. And in Medellin, they made a White House. And the White House really wanted to talk about human conversation, complaints, and other things, and relationship to power. And so they constructed the White House working with local artisans who sewed together all of the cloth. Last drawings that Edgar did with Lithium Collective and editions. And people came and gave their complaints, and they were recorded, and they were sent all around the world. And then the other relational settings I want to show you is in terms of material essence of South Africa. Elsa B. Dixon grew up in the Siri culture, the silk culture, which is over 2,700 years old from the Huguenots. And talk about labor. So, first we're growing the trees, the bugs eat the trees, they harvest the silk, and then Elsa B. has worked harvesting them here in Washington, in her home, seasonally, and she knows that they mostly like to go around round discs. So for many years she did that. She taught this in school, and she worked with the cocoons and everything that was very related to the natural process. But at some point she wanted to push what the silkworms could do, so she gave them square canvases, and she invited several of us to make circuses to see what would happen if the silkworms were challenged. And in her thesis show, she asked them to have them work over mirrors. And then some of the discs were taken off the mirrors, and you saw this very diaphanous, beautiful silk material from the material essence of the silkworm. And also, she embedded the cocoons into custom-made paper. And so the cocoons, most recently, she installed at Arlington in a figure-motion pattern. Very beautiful. Sue Wibbercom from our faculty helped to put up like hundreds of nails so this could happen. Unfortunately, I don't have an image right now. But she also projected an image of how the silkworms chew up the leaves and made sculptures around their structures. And this little brown tile was the pupa. And so the piece she asked me to do, Tom Ashcraft and several of us, Alan Binstock and glass, we all had different materials. Tom used a guitar pick, Alan used glass. And I made a very, very hard beat wax paper, and I pierced words in it. I wanted to know if the silkworms would get down into the words, and they couldn't. So the words remained. The words were show mercy. Navigation Press has also, I think, done a very interesting process with Sieber University from New York, where he used algorithms in his work. So unlike the typical way that we would do the processes linearly to get the work together as subject, he allowed the computer to make 40 different images by putting algorithms into sessions. And then he wasn't sure how to finalize it. So one night we were looking very late, and he saw Andy Warhol pulling silk screen. And he said, I think that's the image we should do. Go back to hand screen printing as the finalization of the image. And so they're very beautiful. You can see them in the Navigation Press. So, a little bit about my own work. How am I doing with time, Carol? Good. Okay. I was delighted to be invited by the Phillips Collection downtown to do a show called Intersections. Intersections means that you respond to an artist or the architecture or a site. And I decided to respond to a site and an artist from the Northwest. His name is Morris Graves. He spent 30 years of his life near LeoLeeVisual, California, in something he developed called the Lake. And he lived alone, and he lived in silence. And he was very agitated as soon as he heard urban noises, like jets going over, or saws, or any kind of noise that invaded his solitude. So I wanted to show the anxieties that I had. If he were alive now, he'd be over 100 years. And how that could play in his landscape, and how that could play in the meaning of degradation of the environment. Because surely the forest that he lived in, the forest that I saw on the way to his place, will change as we move. So the first thing I did in the staircase in the old part of the Phillips Collection was make something about the primordial forest. We drove Sean Watkins and Matt Nolan and I down into the sea, and there was a forest there that absolutely paralyzed me. I've never seen such old forest with so much activity that was completely out of control. So that primordial forest encouraged me to make this We also did a video projection of that same forest, and in the second room, we used Morris Graves' sculpture called Navigation Series that were 3 glass discs. One of them had ore, another one had a little fan on it, and you looked through those, and it was just a very beautifully crafted object. No one wanted to show this work because it wasn't like his other work. So these sat in storage for a very long time until a gallery in the Northwest showed these, an edition of about 6 of them. One's at the Smithsonian. It was made to go up in the first spacecraft to NASA in '63, but they changed the rules. That discouraged Morris Graves, but he made these beautiful objects. So we decided I'd like to respond to that, and I had a plank of wood made that looked like a redwood from that part of the country where Graves lived, and a sculpture where I learned how to make glass opaque enough that it would take a video projection from both sides. And the projection was made looking over Lolita through a webcam, and then also photographing the lake and combining these anxieties with the beauty of the environment. So this is my piece looking through to Morris Graves. On the wall behind that was a piece called Phenomenal Space, which are large pulp paintings, 22 by 40 inches. And they are trying to capture the sound that Graves would have heard from the ocean that was nearby while he was up at the lake. And in the next room, continuing with the idea of the custom formed sheet, trees darker than the night, forgotten. And these are also flax papers that were printed in solar plates. So those of you who think things are hard to print in custom paper, it's not so. And these are drones, and I'm very concerned about cracking. So I was using images that I felt again were threatening the environment. And my voice was projected very quietly in the room onto the wall, a kind of litany of things that were my concern, and hopefully similar to Graves. Graves would go out and draw in the middle of the night what he thought he heard in the forest. And so those anxieties were projected as words onto the flash. It was a great, great honor to show this, and what I didn't know would happen is how many people I would meet when I was there, and what they had to say, and then how many educators brought their classes through. One of the most endearing, I didn't see this, but she sent me the image, were these small children. And because it was in the corner of the room, if you walk a certain distance in front of it, you would see her shadow. And so these children were all pretending they were trees in the forest. And I love the little sleepy boy in front of it. It's like a sleepy tree. So another interest of mine is debris. And I did this print at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And I asked the students who were in the class that were helping me to print the edition to bring their ideas of debris. You know, our body leaves 2,000 pounds of debris every year from nail, hair, skin, you can imagine. And so that's my image pushing down on the industrial monopolies with the genocides underneath, what's underneath the earth. The one that's really interesting, I don't know if you can see it here. Oh, we can do that. Where's my pencil? Is it that? I made it like that. I want to use it later. I'm sorry. Thank you. This one. So that was a student from Virginia whose homestead house was torn down to make a Walmart. That was her statement about debris. This was a kid who wanted to use a refrigerator. This was a student who wanted to have her bedcloth all filled with cell phones. And so it was really a fun project, and it was a lot of chincalés and difficult technical issues, but we did it. The most recent piece I did was for a show that Becky Nolan curated called Drawn Out, Drawn Over. And in Mexico, I was very taken by Oaxaca and Chiapas and the kinds of icons the printers were using. So I came back and I started to make kites that were using a lithograph process those I feel can protect us when we're in this very difficult political atmosphere of free fall. The image is myself falling. Some of those big kites are holding me up. I don't quite get to forward. And some of those kites are going to be in the auctions off the wall. So, the last thing I saw in Mexico was this wonderful project called the Cumbia, La Luna Cumbia. And what this workshop wanted to do was take over culture into the streets and show the cross sectors and link tastes. And what they were asked to do was to choose a song. And that cumbia was then made into whatever kind of print they wanted to. And the lyrics of those songs were very familiar to the public. And so then the public could intervene. And the way they did that was they built a press on a bicycle. And so it's a motorized print shop. And these doors open and close, and they can exhibit the work. The press is there, and they drive around the city. And I thought it was a marvelous idea, so I have been working with a group here of 20 graduates and artists to create something called the Portable Museum. And our concept is to work with movement in the community. It will be a transitional program. It might be multiple, it might be interactive, it might be repetitive like a print experience, but mostly we're going to observe ways we can expand definitions in the community. So that's my new project. And the other one I'm working on is working at a citywide festival in the fall on human trafficking. If any of you are interested in that subject, please see me. We're going to have a lot of work in dance, theater, music, and art. So what have I told you now? Paper is a haptic experience. It's been examined that we know the senses are very important. Despite all the obstacles, we must not lose sight of the fact that profound transformation is possible, whether we're using the traditional or relational studies. I believe it happens always with embodied skill in embedded communities. I want to end with something I wrote. Creativity is central to life. Life is enhanced by collaboration. Collaboration enables hybrids to form. Hybrids activities manifest as synesthesia and transforming into meaningful conversations. Conversations birth new cultural literacy in the community. Cultural literacy enables the making of objects and systems. Objects lead to a larger context of phenomena. Phenomena lives through consciousness. Consciousness promotes creative awareness. Creative awareness is central to life. We as artists are all detonators